You really think this changes anything, Kyle?
This isn't over, Richard. Not by a long shot.
A loud laugh echoed across the sterile, glass-walled conference room, cutting through the tension in the air like a blade. Kyle Jackson, his black skin against the sterile white walls, sat at the long wooden table, shoulders tense, hands clenched in his lap. His manager, Richard Callahan, leaned back in his chair, smirking as he addressed the room. The other employees, all white, shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their eyes darting from one to another, avoiding Kyle's gaze. Richard's words, laced with condescension, rang out. "Come on, Kyle. Just admit it. You're not really up for this kind of work. This is corporate, not whatever it is you think you're cut out for." Kyle's breath caught in his throat. The words, thinly veiled as jokes, were designed to wound. His pulse quickened as he glanced at his co-workers, their silence a complicit acceptance of Richard's words. He wanted to stand up, to challenge the demeaning tone, but fear held him in place. Fear of losing his job, fear of further humiliation, the way of the office, the oppressive tension of unspoken rules, settled on his chest. "Don't take it personally, Kyle," Richard continued, his grin widening. "It's just not your scene. Some people aren't made for the big leagues." Kyle's fist tightened. The smell of stale coffee and cold air mingled in the room, but it was a sting of Richard's casual dismissal that lingered. He stood, his legs trembling, heart racing, the room now silent in the wake of Richard's insult. The sound of a phone buzzing on the table interrupted the moment. Kyle's phone. The screen flashed. The message, one sentence, seemed to freeze the air around him. "We've got your back. You're not alone." Kyle Jackson sat in the conference room, the harsh fluorescent lights above him casting a cold, sterile glow over his face. His palms were sweaty, his fingers fidgeting in his lap as he tried to keep his composure. He had prepared for this meeting for weeks, an important presentation, one that could potentially lead to a promotion, a chance to prove himself at this prestigious corporate firm. But now, as he sat at the long oak table, every word Richard Callahan, his manager, uttered was cutting through him like a knife. Richard, leaning back his chair with a smug grin, let out a loud laugh, his voice echoing in the otherwise quiet room. The few employees gathered around the table chuckled along, their nervous glances bouncing between one another. Kyle's heart raced. He could feel their eyes on him, as if waiting for him to crack, to let the humiliation sink deeper. But he refused to give them that satisfaction. "So, Kyle," Richard drawled, his fingers tapping rhythmically against his coffee cup, "I can't help but wonder, are you really sure you're cut out for this?" He glanced around the room, making eye contact with the others. They nodded in silent agreement, the subtle look of superiority shared between them. The words hit Kyle like a punch to the stomach. They weren't even veiled as a critique. They were a direct insult, a demeaning remark designed to cut him down in front of everyone. "I'm sure I can handle it," Kyle replied, his voice barely above a whisper. He swallowed hard, trying to steady his breath. But Richard wasn't done. "Handle it," Richard scoffed, leaning forward, the smug expression never leaving his face. "Let's be real, Kyle. This is corporate. This is the big leagues. People like you," he paused for effect, his words dripping with condescension. "People like you don't exactly fit in here. You know that, right?" Kyle's stomach twisted. He had heard it all before, over and over, in subtle ways, in backhanded comments and dismissive gestures. But this was different. This was public. The room grew quieter, as if the air had thickened with the weight of Richard's words. The other employees shifted in their seats, looking anywhere but Kyle, as if afraid to be caught in the crossfire. For a moment, everything seemed to slow down. Kyle's pulse thudded in his ears, the noise of the office becoming muffled, distant. He felt a rush of anger flood his veins, but was quickly replaced by a suffocating fear. What would happen if he stood up for himself? Would it cost him his job? Would Richard turn even nastier? The fear of retaliation, of losing the small amount of respect he had, kept him in place, frozen, his fists clenched tight under the table. A small voice in the back of his mind urged him to speak, to call out the injustice. But he couldn't. Not yet. Not here. Richard chuckled again, leaning back in his chair, clearly satisfied with the discomfort he had caused. "Don't take it personally, Kyle," he said with a mock sympathy that stung even more. "It's just not your scene. Some people aren't made for the big leagues." Kyle's hands trembled in his lap, the pressure building, but he kept his eyes on the table, his gaze fixed on the polished wood. The weight of Richard's words hung in the air like a toxic fog. He wanted to speak, to yell, to do anything to break the suffocating silence. But nothing came. The silence in the room stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Kyle's chest rose and fell, his breath shallow and rapid. The door of the conference room creaked, the softest sound, but it startled him. His phone, still in his pocket, buzzed, vibrating against his leg. Without thinking, he reached for it, almost desperately, as if the phone itself could offer him some escape from the suffocating atmosphere of the room. He unlocked it with shaking fingers, glancing down at the screen. It was a message. "We've got your back. You're not alone." Kyle stared at the words, the weight of them crashing into him. For a split second, he forgot about the room, forgot about Richard and the mocking smiles. All he could see were those words, the ones that suddenly made everything feel just a little more bearable. He exhaled slowly, his grip tightening around the phone. There was a shift in the air, a moment where everything inside him screamed to get up, to take action, to stand tall. The message from Jasmine, his old friend, reminded him that he didn't have to fight this battle alone, but he still wasn't sure how to move forward. He couldn't erase the fear, the uncertainty that gnawed at him. Richard's voice broke through the moment, sharp and biting. "What's the matter, Kyle? Cat got your tongue." Kyle didn't respond immediately. His heart pounded in his chest as he stood up, his legs feeling heavy, but the weight of his decision clear. Richard's eyes narrowed, clearly expecting Kyle to retreat, to let the insult slide. The room waited in collective silence, as if holding its breath. But Kyle couldn't remain silent anymore. "I'm not the one who's out of place here, Richard," Kyle said, his voice steadier than he expected. "You are." There was a brief, stunned silence as the room seemed to freeze, the air thick with tension. Richard's jaw clenched and his expression darkened, but Kyle had already started walking toward the door. He didn't care what Richard thought anymore. The sting of humiliation was still sharp, but something had shifted inside him. Something fierce, something defiant. Kyle walked out of the conference room, his mind racing, his heart pounding in his ears. The buzz of his phone was still in his pocket, a small reminder that there was something beyond the walls of his office, a world where he didn't have to shrink, where he wasn't just a target of someone else's prejudice. But as he stepped into the hallway, his phone buzzed again, this time with a call. It was from a lawyer, and for the first time in a long time, Kyle felt like he might actually have a chance. Kyle walked down the hallway, his feet dragging, but his mind was already far beyond the office walls. He could still hear Richard's mocking tone echoing in his ears. The sting of humiliation wasn't gone. It had merely shifted into a quiet, simmering anger. The cold fluorescent lights flickered above him, casting long shadows as he made his way back to his desk. His colleagues had already dispersed after the meeting, their hushed murmurs a faint soundtrack in the background. No one dared to say a word to him. When Kyle reached his cubicle, he stood in the doorway for a moment, staring at the empty chair in front of his computer. The office, his workspace, felt foreign now. The place that had once promised opportunity, recognition, and success now felt like a cage. He sank into the chair, the familiar squeak of the wheels beneath him offering a hollow comfort. A few minutes passed, and the phone on his desk buzzed. It was Jasmine. "Are you okay?" Kyle exhaled slowly and typed out a quick response, his fingers stiff as they hovered over the keys. "I'll be fine. Just needed some space." He set the phone down and stared at the computer screen, the cursor blinking in front of him. The work didn't seem to matter anymore. The numbers and emails, the reports, they all felt insignificant in comparison to what he had just endured. The crushing weight of the moment hung around him, like a dark cloud that refused to dissipate. His co-workers passed by in the open space between cubicles, some of them avoiding eye contact, others glancing at him for a second before quickly looking away. Kyle's gaze lingered on their faces. There was something almost comforting in their silence, something familiar. They weren't saying anything because they didn't want to be dragged into the mess that Richard had created. They were complicit in their inaction, but it was easier to pretend the problem didn't exist. His phone buzzed again, this time with a notification from his inbox. The subject line made his heart skip a beat. Urgent, regarding your complaint. The cold fingers of anxiety curled around his chest as he clicked open the email. It was from HR, an automated message asking him to review his recent complaint about Richard's conduct. But there was no mention of any immediate action, just a vague promise that they would look into it and reach out soon. Kyle couldn't help but laugh bitterly. That was it. That was the company's answer to the systemic issues he had been enduring. A form letter. A quick fix for a problem they didn't want to address. He had known this was coming, yet the hollow response still stung. The phone buzzed once more, and this time it was a text message from Jasmine. I'm really worried about you. Don't let them break you down. You're worth more than they'll ever see. Kyle read the message twice, feeling the warmth of her words seep into him. Jasmine had always been a rock for him, ever since their college days when they leaned on each other through struggles both big and small. She had known the world was never going to be fair to them, but she never let it stop her from pushing forward. And now, she was pushing him to do the same. He typed a response, his fingers moving more fluidly now. Thanks, Jazz. I needed that. I'm trying. He set the phone down, a deep sigh escaping his lips as he leaned back in the chair. His eyes closed for a moment, and in the quiet of his cubicle, he let himself feel the weight of everything, his anger, his disappointment, his fear. It was all tangled together, one unmanageable knot that twisted tighter the longer he let it stay. The phone buzzed again, and Kyle's chest tightened. This time, it was an unfamiliar number. He glanced at the screen, hesitating before answering. Hello, he said cautiously. Kyle Jackson. The voice on the other end was deep, professional, yet there was an undercurrent of urgency in it. Yes, this is Kyle, he replied, his voice shaky, unsure where this was going. This is Laura Perkins. I'm a lawyer with Miller, Stone & Associates. I'm calling in regard to your complaint against Richard Callahan and the other discriminatory practices at your company. Are you available for a confidential conversation? Kyle's stomach dropped. The room suddenly felt smaller, the walls closer. His heart began to race. I don't know what this is about, he stammered, glancing around his empty cubicle, as if the walls could somehow offer him some sort of comfort. We've been conducting a preliminary investigation into the company's practices, Laura continued, her tone calm but firm. Several employees have come forward with similar complaints. Your situation is part of a broader pattern we're looking into. If you're willing, we'd like to discuss what's been happening and how we can help. Kyle's breath caught. His mind raced. This is real. It's happening. For a moment, he was paralyzed, the enormity of what he was being asked to do crashing over him. I don't know, Kyle said slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. I've just been trying to keep my head down. But Richard, he's always done this. And I'm not the only one. We can help, Laura interjected, her voice gentle but insistent. You don't have to face this alone, Kyle. This kind of behavior is unacceptable. We have the means to hold your employer accountable. For a long moment, Kyle said nothing. His thoughts were spinning, but beneath the fear and hesitation, there was something else rising, a spark of defiance. He had been silent for so long, swallowed by fear of retaliation, but hearing Laura's voice, knowing that there was someone who understood, someone who could help, made something in him snap. He took a deep breath, his hand gripping the edge of his desk. I'm in, Kyle said, his voice stronger now, more resolute. Let's do this. The following morning, Kyle sat at his desk, his fingers tapping against the keys of his keyboard, without really typing anything. His mind kept drifting back to the phone call with Laura Perkins, the lawyer from Miller, Stone & Associates. It had only been a few hours, but the weight of what he'd agreed to was already settling in his chest. He had never imagined his life would come to this. A legal battle against his employer, against Richard, against the toxic environment that had been wearing him down for years. His hands trembled slightly as he tried to focus on the email in front of him, but the words blurred together. Every inch of him felt both heavy and restless. caught between hope and fear. He glanced at the clock on his desk. 12:15 p.m. lunchtime. The office was quieter than usual, and the hum of the air conditioning filled the silence around him. The soft murmur of co-workers speaking in hushed tones filtered in from nearby cubicles. He knew they were all still avoiding him, suddenly so much more distant after the meeting the day before. None of them had approached him yet, as if acknowledging the tension would somehow make it worse. He picked up his phone, deciding to take a break and text Jasmine. He needed a moment to breathe, to hear a voice that understood him. "I'm meeting up with you after work. Need to talk." As soon as he hit send, his phone buzzed with a reply. "I'm there. Come by my office at 5. You've got this, Kyle." For the first time in a while, a small smile tugged at Kyle's lips. Jasmine had always been an anchor in his life, the person who saw through the facade and understood the struggle. She'd been with him during the rough times, when the world seemed like it was stacked against them both. But today was different. Kyle wasn't just going through the motions anymore. He was stepping into something far bigger than the daily grind. The realization was both terrifying and exhilarating. He grabbed his lunch, something quick, a sandwich he didn't even taste, and sat at his desk, scrolling through the news on his phone. But nothing could keep his mind from racing. He had to get out of the office, to breathe. He needed to feel like himself again before the weight of the coming battle truly hit him. Around 1:30 p.m., he stood up and grabbed his jacket, deciding to take a walk outside for a few minutes. His mind was buzzing with the realization that this would not be over quickly. He could already feel the eyes of his co-workers on him, their whispers drifting just out of earshot. Kyle was beginning to understand just how much of an inconvenience his presence had become in their pristine, polished world. As he stepped outside, the afternoon sun felt warmer than usual, a welcome change from the cold, artificial atmosphere of the office. The city was alive, bustling. People walking hurriedly along the sidewalk, the distant sound of car engines and conversations blending together. He turned a corner, heading toward the small park he often visited during lunch breaks. The air was a little fresher here, and for a moment, he could forget the tension building in his chest. He needed a distraction, something to ground him, and then he saw her. Jasmine was sitting on a bench beneath a large oak tree, her back straight and her eyes scanning the book in her hands. She had always loved reading, her escape from the world. As soon as she saw him, she looked up and smiled, her face lighting up with genuine warmth. She stood up and walked over, her arms wide for a hug. "Hey," she said softly, pulling him into a tight embrace. "I'm glad you called. Needed to get away from the office for a bit," Kyle replied, a bit of tension still in his voice. "I've been thinking a lot." Jasmine stepped back and gave him a knowing look. "It's okay to be scared, Kyle. I can't even imagine how heavy all this must feel. But you're doing the right thing." Kyle let out a deep breath, feeling the weight of her words sink in. "I don't know. I mean, it's one thing to feel like I'm not welcome here, but now it's going to be a full-on fight. Richard isn't going to just let me walk away from this." "I know," she said, her tone serious. "But you have something he doesn't. The truth. The truth has a way of catching up with people like him." Kyle nodded slowly, but doubt still lingered in his chest. Jasmine had always been optimistic, but he couldn't shake the fear of what might happen. Losing his job would be one thing, but what if it went further? What if the entire system was rigged against him? What if this whole battle was bigger than he could handle? "I've been so quiet for so long," he confessed. "I don't know if I even know how to fight back." "You don't have to fight alone," she said firmly, her voice almost a command. "We've got your back, remember? I'm not the only one who's going to stand by you. There are more people who are starting to see what's going on here. You're not alone." Kyle looked into her eyes, feeling the strength in her words. She was right. He didn't have to face this fight alone. He had a team behind him, even if they weren't all in the same room. The lawyer, the few co-workers who had begun to whisper about the injustice, and now Jasmine. He was beginning to realize he had allies. "I can't do it without you, Jazz," he said quietly. "You don't have to," she replied, squeezing his arm reassuringly. "I'm here every step of the way." Kyle stood there for a long moment, feeling the warm sun on his face, the breeze stirring the leaves overhead. For the first time in a while, he allowed himself to breathe deeply, to take in the moment. Maybe it wasn't going to be easy, but he had a chance. And that was enough. As they sat down on the park bench together, the conversation shifted to lighter topics. Old memories, new projects, what the future could look like. But in the back of Kyle's mind, he could still hear Richard's mocking voice, still feel the weight of the injustice, still know that the fight was far from over. But for now, as he sat next to his best friend, he allowed himself this moment of peace. It wouldn't last long, but it was enough to remind him why he had to keep going. Kyle arrived at work the next morning with a new determination in his step. His conversation with Jasmine had been a turning point, a moment when the weight of the world had lifted, if only for a little while. The promise of support, the sense of not being alone in the battle, gave him a sense of purpose he hadn't had the day before. But as he walked to the glass doors of the building, the familiar sense of dread slowly crept back in. The office was as busy as usual, people rushing around, papers flying, phones ringing, but to Kyle, everything seemed muted. He walked through the aisles of cubicles, his co-workers offering quick glances but no real words. The silence that followed him was deafening, a constant reminder of the uncomfortable truth. Richard's words had done more damage than Kyle had realized. He wasn't just a target of one man's cruelty. He had become the symbol of the office's indifference, a living reminder of the power imbalances that existed in every corner of the workplace. He sat down at his desk, staring at the email he had started drafting before leaving the office yesterday. It was still there, half-written, still unsubmitted, a formal complaint that could change everything. But each time he hovered over the send button, a flicker of doubt stopped him. What if nothing changed? What if this only made things worse? He stared at his screen for a long time, unsure whether to go through with it. Just then, his phone buzzed on the desk, breaking his train of thought. He glanced at the screen and saw that it was an unknown number. His pulse quickened. Laura's number, the lawyer's office. The nerves that had settled slightly the night before came rushing back. He answered, his voice betraying the uncertainty that still lingered. "Hello? Kyle!" It was Laura, her voice steady but with a sense of urgency. "This is Laura Perkins again. I have some news." His heart skipped a beat. "Is it about Richard?" "Yes, but it's bigger than just him. We've been investigating some of the patterns of discrimination within your company, and we've come across some troubling evidence." Laura continued, "You're not the only one. There are others who've experienced similar things, and we've identified clear instances of bias within the corporate structure." Kyle's stomach dropped, but in the pit of it, there was something else, a small flicker of hope. "What does this mean?" "It means we're moving forward, Kyle. The company will be facing a formal investigation, and we're gathering evidence from other employees. We're preparing a case. Your situation is central to it." Kyle's mind spun, the weight of her words settling over him. He thought back to the first time Richard had humiliated him in front of team. He thought about every little comment, every slight, and he thought about how it had all been accepted as part of the culture. But now it seemed there was a way out, a chance to make it right. "Are you asking me to testify?" Kyle's voice was hoarse. "Yes, but you don't have to decide right now. Just know that we're with you, and we have your back," Laura said, her voice offering reassurance. "You're not alone in this." Before Kyle could respond, the sound of footsteps approaching his desk made him freeze. He looked up to see Richard standing in front of him, his arms crossed and a cold smirk plastered on his face. Well, Kyle," Richard said, his voice laced with sarcasm. "How's everything going today? I trust you're not still brooding over our little chat from yesterday." He leaned in closer, lowering his voice so only Kyle could hear. "I hope you don't expect any handouts here. You'll never make it in the big leagues if you can't handle a little criticism." Kyle's pulse raced. Richard had always had a way of making him feel small, insignificant. But today, something inside Kyle snapped. The fear that had gripped him for so long, the fear of speaking out, of challenging the abuse, seemed to vanish in an instant. "Actually, Richard," Kyle began, his voice calm but firm, "I've been thinking a lot about what you said yesterday, and I've decided to do something about it." Richard raised an eyebrow, clearly amused. "Oh, and what's that?" Kyle took a breath, his hand steadying on the desk. I'm taking legal action against you and the company for discrimination. For a brief moment, Richard looked taken back, his eyes narrowing. The room around them seemed to fade into the background. Kyle could hear his own heartbeat in his ears, but his voice remained steady. You think you're going to win this? Richard sneered, his smile fading. Good luck with that. You won't even last a week without your precious little job here. They'll never believe you over me. Kyle met his gaze without flinching. I don't need you to believe me. I have proof, and I'm not afraid anymore. There was a tense silence as Richard stood there, his smirk faltering, before he straightened up and turned to walk away, but not before giving Kyle one last venomous look. Don't say I didn't warn you, Richard spat, his voice low and threatening. You'll regret this. As the door to Kyle's cubicle slammed shut, a rush of adrenaline surged through him. He had done it. He had finally spoken up. And as the silence of the office enveloped him again, Kyle felt something he hadn't felt in years. He felt like he had control. His phone buzzed again. It was another message from Laura. I know it's not easy, but you're doing the right thing. We're moving forward. You're not alone. Kyle stared at the message for a long moment before replying. Thank you. I'm ready. The rest of the day passed in a blur for Kyle. He barely registered the emails piling up in his inbox, the chattering voices of his colleagues drifting past his cubicle, or even the way Richard kept glancing over at him from his office. All Kyle could focus on was the weight of his own decision, the looming legal battle that was now in motion. He couldn't remember the last time he had felt this conflicted, caught between a rising hope that maybe, just maybe, this fight could lead to something better, and the gut-wrenching fear of what would happen when the full force of the company turned on him. His hands trembled slightly as he typed his responses to emails, his mind replaying Richard's taunts, the sharp, dismissive tone Richard had used. And yet, there was a quiet satisfaction in knowing that, for once, he wasn't going to sit idly by. When the workday finally ended, Kyle packed up his things in a mechanical daze. He grabbed his jacket from the back of his chair, shoved his phone into his pocket, and walked out of the office building without saying goodbye to anyone. The cool evening air hit his face as he stepped outside, and for a brief moment, it felt like he was walking away from the weight of everything, like he could breathe again. He pulled his phone out of his pocket as he walked, glancing down at the screen. It was a call from Laura Perkins. His heart raced. The events of the day had left him feeling like he was living on the edge of something big, and now it felt as if everything might be coming to a head. He answered the call, trying to steady his voice. Laura, he said, his tone both curious and anxious. What's going on? Kyle, it's time to prepare, Laura said, her voice firm. We've got confirmation. The company's response to your complaint is coming faster than expected. They're going to try to shut this down before it even gets started. Richard is already circling the wagons. You need to be ready for anything. Kyle's stomach tightened at her words. He had known that Richard wouldn't take his legal threat lightly, but hearing it confirmed sent a chill through him. What do I need to do? I need you to gather everything, Laura said quickly. Emails, texts, any documentation of discrimination you faced. If you can, we want to see any correspondence that directly involves Richard, and I know you've got some. We need to have everything ready before they start trying to discredit you. Kyle's pulse quickened. He had collected some evidence in the past. Little things. An inappropriate comment here. A microaggression there. But now this was real. This was a fight. I've got some stuff, he said, his voice more confident than he felt. I'll pull it all together tonight. Laura was silent for a moment before she spoke again, her tone softer. Kyle, this is going to be tough. You need to understand that. There's a lot riding on this, but we'll be with you every step of the way. It's not just your job that's at risk. Your reputation, your relationships, everything. They'll make you question your every move. Kyle clenched his jaw, his grip tightening on his phone. I know what I'm up against. I've been living it for years. I'm not backing down now. Laura's voice softened. Good. And don't forget, there are others out there. They're watching. They've seen what Richard and others like him have done, and they're waiting for someone to stand up. You're not alone in this. The weight of her words hit him harder than expected. He had been so focused on his own struggle, on the battle that was about to unfold, that he hadn't stopped to think about the larger picture. The system that had enabled Richard to behave as he did wasn't just about one man. It was about a culture that protected the powerful and pushed down everyone else. "I'll get everything together tonight," Kyle said, his voice resolute. "Thank you, Laura. I appreciate everything." "Don't thank me yet," she said with a small laugh. "This is just the beginning." The call ended, and Kyle stood still on the sidewalk, his breath coming a little faster now. He realized that, for the first time in a long while, he felt alive. There was a weight to it, heavy and thick, but it was also a strange kind of power, a feeling he hadn't had in years. Kyle made his way to the nearby cafe where he and Jasmine had agreed to meet. The walk was short, but every step felt like the calm before the storm. As he stepped into the warm, familiar space of the cafe, he spotted Jasmine sitting at a corner table. She looked up as he entered, her face breaking into a smile. But when she saw the look in Kyle's eyes, the smile faded, replaced by a look of concern. "You okay?" she asked, her voice low. Kyle nodded as he sat down across from her. "Yeah, I'm okay. It's all starting to feel real now." Jasmine tilted her head, her expression soft but understanding. "I know it's hard, but you're doing the right thing. They can't just keep getting away with it." Kyle exhaled slowly, rubbing his eyes. "I know, but it's scary. Richard's not going to just let this go, and I don't know what they'll do to me once I've gone public. This could cost me everything. My job, my career. I'm risking it all, Jasmine reached across the table, placing a hand over his. "You're not alone in this, Kyle. And you're more than just your job. This is bigger than that. You're showing people what's really going on behind closed doors. And trust me, they're watching. They've been waiting for someone like you to take a stand." For the first time that day, Kyle felt the weight of his decision begin to lift. Jasmine was right. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the countless others who had come before him, the ones who had suffered silently for too long, afraid to speak up because they thought they were alone. He sat back in his chair, taking a deep breath. "I'll do it. I'm in this for the long haul, whatever it takes." Jasmine gave him a warm smile. "I'm proud of you." Kyle smiled back, feeling something shift inside him. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but he wasn't afraid anymore, not with people like Jasmine and Laura by his side. He had taken the first step, and the rest would follow. Kyle spent the next few days in a blur of activity. After his conversation with Jasmine, he had thrown himself into preparing for the fight ahead. He scoured his emails, combed through old messages and texts, and compiled any and all evidence that could support his case. It was exhausting, but it was necessary. The more he gathered, the clearer it became that the company's practices were not just isolated incidents. There was a pattern here, one that had been ignored for far too long. He had always been the type of person to keep his head down, to do his work and avoid stirring the pot. But now, as he pored over the documents, a simmering anger started to build inside him. He wasn't just fighting for his own dignity anymore. He was fighting for everyone who had been silenced, for everyone who had been overlooked or dismissed because of the color of their skin. And that thought, that drive, kept him going. But even as his resolve grew, so did his anxiety. The stakes were higher than ever now. He wasn't just up against Richard anymore. He was up against the entire system, a system that had been built to protect the powerful, to silence those who dare to speak out. The fear of retaliation, the fear of losing everything never fully left him. By Friday afternoon, Kyle had collected all the evidence he could. The emails were stacked high on his desk, and he made copies of the most damning messages. He had documents detailing Richard's past actions, both his blatant microaggressions and his more subtle, insidious acts of discrimination. Kyle had even reached out to a few colleagues, cautiously asking them if they had witnessed anything or had similar experiences. Some were hesitant to speak up, but a few had agreed to meet with him. It wasn't much yet, but it was a start. As Kyle sat at his desk, scrolling through the stack of papers one last time, his phone buzzed. It was Laura. "Kyle, are you free to talk?" Her message read. "There's something important we need to discuss." His heart skipped a beat. He quickly tapped the phone to call her back, his mind racing with possibilities. What could it be? Was something happening with the investigation? "Laura?" Kyle said when she picked up. "What's going on?" "We got some new developments," Laura replied, her tone tense. "I've been in touch with some of the other employees who've had issues with Richard. We've confirmed they've been warned about his behavior multiple times, but the company did nothing. Now, Richard is aware of the investigation. He's getting nervous, and that's never a good sign. I'm concerned he's going to try to take drastic action to cover it all up." Kyle's stomach twisted. "What kind of drastic action?" "I don't know yet, but I need you to be extra careful," Laura said, her voice dropping slightly. "I'm going to make sure you have some backup, but I need you to stay alert. Richard is the kind of person who doesn't let things go easily. If he feels threatened, he might try to retaliate against you or anyone else involved. And it's not just about your job anymore. This could escalate quickly." The fear that had been quietly simmering in the back of Kyle's mind came rushing forward. He had known this would be difficult, but he hadn't expected it to feel this dangerous. "Should I stop gathering the evidence?" Kyle asked, a sudden sense of uncertainty clouding his judgment. "No," Laura replied firmly. "You need to keep going. This isn't just for you, Kyle. It's for all the others who've been silenced, for everyone who's too afraid to speak out. But I'll make sure you have the legal protections in place to minimize the risks. Just keep your head down, gather what you can, and don't engage with Richard directly unless you absolutely have to." Kyle exhaled slowly. "Okay, I can do that." "Good," Laura said. "I'll check in with you later this weekend. We're getting closer, Kyle, but we have to keep moving forward." As the call ended, Kyle sat back in his chair, his hands shaking. He had been prepared for personal consequences. The fear of retaliation, the potential loss of his job. But the idea that Richard might take more drastic steps, might try to silence him completely, felt like a line being crossed into something much more dangerous. The reality of the fight ahead was becoming clearer. This wasn't just about standing up for what was right. This was about survival. Kyle couldn't afford to back down now. He had come too far, had invested too much of himself into this. But the fear that had been gnawing at him ever since the conversation with Laura now seemed unavoidable. He was playing a dangerous game, and he wasn't sure what the next move would be. That afternoon, as Kyle met with one of his co-workers, another employee who had agreed to meet him outside of work hours, he found himself reflecting on what Laura had said. The conversation with his colleague was a blur of shared frustration, both of them hesitant, but finally speaking the truth they had both held inside for too long. His colleague, an older man named Greg, had worked at the company for over 15 years. He had seen the subtle, systemic racism that pervaded the office, and although he had witnessed Richard's behavior, he had never said anything, afraid of losing his job. "I should have spoken up sooner," Greg confessed, his voice low. "But I was scared. It's like they have you trapped. You speak out and they destroy you. They pick you apart. They make you the problem." Kyle nodded, understanding completely. He had felt that same fear for years. The quiet sense of being trapped in a system that saw him as less than, that saw his skin as an obstacle to success. But now, he was pushing against it. And Greg's decision to finally speak up, to stand beside him, was a small but important step in breaking that silence. They talked for a while longer, the conversation veering from the company's discriminatory practices to their shared experiences in the workplace. Greg offered Kyle a few more pieces of information, some personal accounts that might be useful in the case, but his words of encouragement were the most valuable. "You're doing the right thing, Kyle. It's not just for you. It's for all of us." As Kyle left their meeting and walked back to his apartment, he thought about Greg's words. It was becoming more and more clear. This fight wasn't just about him. It was about everyone who had been ignored, disregarded, or silenced. And he was no longer afraid of losing it all. What he was gaining, the chance to stand up, to make a real difference, was worth far more than the job or the reputation he had once been so careful to protect. But as he walked through the darkened streets, he couldn't shake the feeling that everything he had worked for could be taken from him in an instant. Monday morning arrived like a quiet storm, the weight of the weekend's preparation hanging over Kyle as he entered the office. The air felt thicker than usual, more oppressive. The walls that had always seemed so sterile now felt like they were closing in on him, suffocating him with an overwhelming sense of dread. He had no illusions anymore. He knew the fight was only just beginning, and it wasn't going to be easy. But there was something different in his step that day. He wasn't walking with the same hesitancy or fear he had before. Each step felt deliberate, as if he were preparing for a battle. The power of his decision, the decision to stand up, to confront the injustice head-on, was starting to take root within him. As Kyle settled into his desk, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that things weren't going to stay quiet for long. Richard's absence from the office that morning had only made it worse. No one was saying anything, but the tension in the air was palpable. Kyle could sense it in the sideways glances, the hushed conversations that seemed to stop as soon as he walked by. It was as if everyone knew something was happening, but no one wanted to acknowledge it directly. Around mid-morning, as Kyle sat in the break room sipping his coffee, he saw it, Richard, walking toward him with a purposeful stride. His manager's face was drawn tight, the usual smug expression replaced by something colder, more calculating. Kyle's pulse quickened, but he stood his ground, refusing to look away. Well, Richard said, his voice low and sharp. You're still here. I thought you might have left by now. Kyle met his gaze without flinching. He could feel the contempt radiating off Richard, but he wouldn't let it shake him. I'm not going anywhere, Richard, he said, his voice steady. Richard's eyes narrowed. You think this is going to end well for you? Do you really think you have the power to take me down? His tone was a mix of mockery and veiled menace, the kind of underhanded threat that made Kyle's skin crawl. I don't need to take you down, Richard, Kyle replied, his voice cutting through the tension. I just need to stand up for what's right. You're the one who's in the wrong. The silence between them stretched long enough for the other employees in the break room to notice. Kyle could feel their eyes on him, their silent judgment pressing in from all sides. But he didn't care. For the first time in a long while, he didn't care about what they thought. This wasn't just about him and Richard anymore. It was about everyone who had been pushed aside, ignored, and dismissed for too long. Richard's face twisted into a sneer. You don't understand how this works, do you? He said, his voice dripping with disdain. People like you, people who think they can challenge the system, always lose. You'll never win against me. Kyle's heart raced, but he kept his composure. I don't need to win against you, he said quietly. I just need to expose the truth. For a brief moment, Richard seemed to hesitate, his expression flickering with something that looked like uncertainty before the sneer returned. We'll see how long that lasts, he said coldly, turning on his heel and walking out of the break room, leaving Kyle standing there, the weight of the encounter settling into his chest. As Kyle watched Richard leave, a strange sense of calm settled over him. It wasn't a victory, not by any means, but it was a shift. Richard was rattled. That much was clear. He had underestimated Kyle, and now it was too late for him to take it back. The rest of the day passed in a strange sort of quiet. Kyle went about his work, but his mind was elsewhere, focused on the upcoming steps. He knew it was only a matter of time before things escalated. Richard wouldn't let this go. But now, Kyle felt more prepared, more empowered. He had support, both legal and emotional. He wasn't doing this alone. At the end of the day, Kyle sat at his desk, finishing up a report that had been lingering for days. He felt exhausted, but there was a quiet sense of satisfaction that came with the decision he had made. He was fighting for something bigger than himself, for a cause that was worth the risk. It was a hard truth, but he had come to accept it. He might lose everything, his job, his career, even his reputation, but he would never regret standing up. His phone buzzed, snapping him from his thoughts. It was a text from Laura. We've got news. It's time. Are you ready? Kyle's breath caught in his throat. His hands trembled as he quickly typed a reply. Ready as I'll ever be. He took a deep breath and stood up from his desk. The fight was just beginning, but Kyle felt something in him shift. The battle would be difficult, and there would be sacrifices along the way, but he was no longer afraid. As Kyle walked out of the office, his mind raced with the next steps. He had to meet with Laura again, finalize everything. He had to make sure everything was in place for what was coming. The company was about to face an entirely new kind of pressure, and Kyle knew it was only a matter of time before the truth started to come out. The power shift had already begun. And as Kyle stepped into the cool evening air, he realized that he wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for something that could change the system for everyone who had been oppressed, who had been ignored, who had been silenced for far too long. The days that followed were a blur of meetings, documents, and late nights. Kyle, with the help of Laura and the few brave co-workers who had come forward, had assembled a detailed and damning case against Richard and the corporate culture that had allowed his behavior to flourish unchecked. The evidence was undeniable: emails, text messages, testimonies. And now it was time for the company to face the consequences. The moment Kyle had been dreading was now here. The formal investigation was set to begin. Kyle had hoped for a quick resolution, but deep down, he knew it would be anything but easy. Richard, predictably, had launched a full-scale campaign to discredit Kyle, trying to paint him as a troublemaker, a disgruntled employee who had simply misunderstood his comments. The company's HR department, known for its strict neutrality, was suddenly nowhere to be found when it came to addressing the underlying issues. On the day the investigation officially started, Kyle walked into the office feeling like he was walking into a battlefield. His usual routine had been replaced by a tight knot in his stomach, the weight of everything he had set in motion now fully on his shoulders. He knew the risks. The company could easily bury the investigation. They could destroy him. And in many ways, they had the power to make this all disappear. But he couldn't turn back now. As he walked through the glass doors of the building, his phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a text from Laura. The internal review starts today. Richard is under investigation. I know you're scared, but keep going. We're not backing down. Kyle swallowed hard. The words helped steady his nerves, but he still wasn't sure what to expect. He had been up against a machine, a system built to protect the powerful and to crush anyone who dared to challenge it. But now, with the truth on his side, with others standing beside him, he had a small but crucial advantage. The day passed slowly, with no sign of the investigation officially beginning. The atmosphere in the office was tense, but Kyle did his best to keep his focus. He kept his interactions brief, his eyes constantly on his phone, waiting for an update from Laura or the lawyer's office. He knew something big was coming, and it was only a matter of time before Richard retaliated. Around mid-afternoon, he received a call from an unfamiliar number. His heart raced as he answered. "Kyle, it's Laura," she said quickly. "We've got a problem." "What's happened?" Kyle's voice was tight with anxiety. "They've already started pushing back. Richard's team is trying to suppress the investigation. They're using their power to bury it. They've even threatened legal action if we proceed with the evidence." Kyle's stomach dropped. "What does that mean for us?" "It means they're trying to intimidate you. They're trying to shut this down before it gets any bigger. But we've got enough to keep it moving forward. We're not backing down, and neither should you." The words were a lifeline, but Kyle couldn't ignore the chill that had settled over him. He had known Richard would fight back, but this was different. The company wasn't just trying to protect Richard. They were trying to protect their own image, their reputation, their standing in the industry. Kyle was a threat, and they were making it clear that they would do whatever it took to eliminate that threat. As Kyle hung up the phone, he could feel the eyes of his co-workers on him again. The whispers, the side glances. Richard's retaliation was already starting. He knew the company would try to isolate him, to make him feel alone in this fight. But he refused to let them. An hour later, the call came that would change everything. HR called Kyle into an impromptu meeting. As he walked into the room, he was greeted not by the usual HR representatives, but by the stern faces of two corporate lawyers. Their presence alone sent a cold chill down his spine. Kyle Jackson. One of the lawyers said, his voice formal, but laced with an undertone of hostility. "We've received multiple complaints about your behavior in the workplace. We've been informed that you've been disruptive, causing division within the company. You made false claims about discrimination, and we need to discuss this matter immediately." Kyle's chest tightened. The words hit like a punch. Disruptive? False claims? The very accusations they had thrown at him to discredit him had now come full circle. It was exactly what he had expected. An attempt to make him the problem, to make him the one who had caused a disturbance. "I haven't made false claims," Kyle said, his voice steady, though his mind was racing. "I've only stated the truth." The investigation will prove that. The lawyer's gaze hardened. We don't need an investigation. We've already reviewed your claims and found no substantial evidence. Richard Callahan denies all allegations. The company stands by its employees. The air in the room felt suffocating. Kyle could feel the walls closing in, his pulse quickening. This isn't about Richard. This is about the culture you've allowed to exist. The discrimination that's been tolerated. The silence that has enabled it. The lawyer leaned forward, his voice low and menacing. This is your final warning, Kyle. If you don't retract your claims, there will be consequences. Legal consequences. Your career will be over before it even begins. The words were a threat, not just against his job, but against his very future. Kyle's breath caught in his throat as the weight of it all pressed down on him. They were trying to break him. They wanted him to quit, to back down, to accept the status quo. But then Kyle thought about everything he had sacrificed, his dignity, his peace, his silence. And he realized that he couldn't back down now. Not for them. Not for Richard. Not for anyone. I won't retract my claims, Kyle said, his voice firm, no longer shaking. I've made my decision. If you want to destroy me, you'll have to do it in front of the world. I'm not backing down. There was a long silence as the lawyer studied him. Finally, the man nodded slowly, almost with a sense of resignation. Very well. We'll see how this plays out. But don't say we didn't warn you. As Kyle left the room, his legs felt like they might give way beneath him. But he was resolute. He had stood his ground, and now it was time to see just how far the company would go to protect their own. The battle had taken a dangerous turn, but Kyle wasn't about to lose. The next few weeks dragged on like a blur of paperwork, meetings, and silence. Kyle could feel the tension in the office every day, like an electric charge in the air. His colleagues had retreated into their cubicles, avoiding eye contact, and the whispers that once followed him were now even more pronounced. Richard had not been seen in the office for days. His absence was conspicuous, but the sense of impending doom that hung over the building was even more so. But Kyle kept pushing forward. He had made his decision, and he wasn't going to back down. Despite the mounting pressure, he had made it clear that he would see this through. His phone buzzed regularly with messages of support from Laura and Jasmine, but the isolation Kyle felt at work grew by the day. It wasn't just the company pushing back. The pressure from his personal life was beginning to mount as well. His family, who had always been supportive but cautious about his career, had begun to ask more questions. His mother called him every evening, her voice trembling with concern. "You don't have to do this, Kyle," she said one evening, her voice filled with the quiet panic that had become familiar to him. "You're going to lose everything. Is it really worth it?" "I don't have a choice," Kyle replied, his voice tight. "I can't let this go. I can't be quiet anymore, Mom. This isn't just for me. It's for everyone who's ever had to put up with this." She didn't respond at first, but Kyle could hear the hesitation in her silence. She had been through enough herself, dealing with the challenges of being a black woman in a world that often felt hostile. She had taught him to be strong, to hold his ground. But now she was scared for him. "I understand, son," she said after a long pause. "Just be careful. Please." Kyle's heart ached as he hung up the phone. He had always wanted to protect his family from the pain and struggles he had faced, but now, in standing up for himself, he was putting them in a line of fire. The emotional cost of his decision was starting to take its toll on him, too. His confidence, his conviction, they were becoming harder to hold on to. The following morning, as Kyle walked into the office, he was met with an unusual sight. There, sitting at the same conference table where Richard had humiliated him weeks ago, was a group of executives. They were staring at him as he entered, their eyes sharp, their gazes calculating. For a moment, Kyle froze, his breath catching in his throat. He knew what this was. An ambush. Richard's face was among them, his smirk gone, replaced by an icy, professional mask. He was flanked by two other men, lawyers, no doubt, their presence a clear sign that this meeting would not be friendly. "Kyle," Richard said, his voice cold and devoid of the usual mockery, "we've been reviewing your actions over the past few weeks, and frankly, we decided it's time to have a serious conversation." Kyle stood tall, his back straight, refusing to let them intimidate him. He had already made up his mind, and there was nothing they could say that would change it now. "I'm listening," Kyle said, his voice firm. Richard motioned to the two lawyers beside him. One of them, a stern-looking man with a balding head, stood up and placed a folder in front of Kyle. The words on the papers were almost indistinguishable from the blur of emotions and thoughts that were running through his mind, but the message was clear. They were about to offer him a deal, a bribe. "We believe the situation could be resolved amicably," the lawyer said, his tone clinical. "If you withdraw your complaint and agree to a non-disclosure agreement, we are prepared to offer you a financial settlement. You would be paid handsomely for your silence, and in return, you walk away with your career intact. No one will need to know about the complaints you've raised. No one will need to know about the allegations." Kyle's pulse quickened. The offer was tempting, but he had seen this before. This was a typical corporate tactic. Silence the whistleblower with money, protect the company's image at all costs, and move on as if nothing had happened. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could respond, Richard interjected, his voice smooth and convincing. "You have to understand, Kyle, we're not trying to hurt you. We just want to protect the company's reputation. This is a generous offer, and it's in everyone's best interest." Kyle's hands tightened into fists on the table. His mind was racing, and for a moment, he considered the option, the financial security, the relief from the constant pressure, the chance to walk away from all of this. It was tempting, but then his eyes flashed back to the documents in front of him. The truth. "I don't want your money," Kyle said, his voice steady, cutting through the tension in the room. "I want accountability. I want change." Richard's jaw tightened. The lawyers exchanged a look, but neither of them spoke. There was a moment of stunned silence in the room, broken only by the soft rustle of papers as Kyle stood up from the table. "I'm not backing down," Kyle said firmly, his voice unwavering. "You can't buy my silence. I'm going to fight this, and I'm going to make sure everyone knows the truth." Richard's eyes narrowed, the cool professionalism fading for a brief moment, replaced by a flicker of anger, but he quickly masked it with a tight smile. "We'll see about that, Kyle," Richard said coldly. "You've made your choice, but don't expect things to be easy from here on out." As Kyle left the conference room, his heart was pounding in his chest, but he felt something he hadn't in a long time: empowered. He had made his stand, and there was no turning back now. The fight was only getting more difficult, but he was ready. The walls that had once seemed like barriers were now crumbling. The company's efforts to silence him were no longer working. They had underestimated him. They had underestimated the power of truth. But as Kyle walked through the halls, he knew that things were about to get much harder. The company would strike back, and it would strike hard. He had no illusions about what was coming next, but he was no longer afraid. He had come too far, and now he wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for everyone who had been silenced before him. The fall of the powerful had begun, and Kyle Jackson was leading the charge. The weeks that followed Kyle's refusal to accept the settlement were grueling. The corporate machine shifted into full gear, and with it, the battle escalated into something far more vicious than he had imagined. The company's retaliation was swift and brutal. Richard, who had been conspicuously absent for most of the investigation, reappeared, his presence as cold and calculating as ever. His tactics had become more direct, more personal. He had begun spreading rumors about Kyle, questioning his professionalism in front of anyone who would listen. Richard even went so far as to manipulate certain employees into making vague, negative comments about Kyle's performance, hoping to undermine his credibility. Despite all of this, Kyle refused to back down. His determination only grew with each passing day. The weight of his decision had only deepened. What started as a personal fight for justice had become a mission to expose the toxic culture that had allowed people like Richard to thrive unchecked for so long. As the investigation moved forward, Kyle's actions began to gain attention beyond the walls of the office. More employees came forward, some anonymously, others more bravely, to share their own stories of discrimination and abuse. Slowly but surely, the truth began to unravel, one confession at a time. But with each new piece of evidence that surfaced, the company's response became harsher. They couldn't allow the walls to fall. Kyle was now the face of a movement that threatened everything the company stood for, and they were determined to bury it before it gained any more momentum. Kyle had been summoned to a final meeting with the company's executives, this time with the full weight of their legal team present. The stakes were clear. This was the company's last-ditch effort to force him into submission. As he sat in the same sterile conference room, facing the same cold faces of the people who had made him feel so small for so long, Kyle felt an eerie sense of calm. Richard was there, sitting at the head of the table, his eyes narrowed in a silent challenge. "Kyle," the lead executive said, his voice smooth and practiced, "we've tried to offer you a resolution, but you've refused to cooperate. Now, it's time for us to move forward with the necessary steps. We've spoken with our legal team, and the company is fully prepared to defend itself. We have evidence that calls your character and your accusations into question. Are you sure you want to continue down this path?" Kyle's heart pounded, but his resolve remained firm. They were threatening him, hoping to scare him into submission, but he had already made up his mind. There was no turning back now. "I'm not backing down," Kyle said, his voice steady, unwavering. "The truth is on my side, and I won't be intimidated by you or anyone else. This is bigger than me. It's bigger than all of us. This company has a responsibility to make things right. You can't just silence the truth with your threats." Richard's smirk faltered, his eyes flashing with a mix of annoyance and something else, something deeper, more desperate. For the first time, Kyle could see a crack in Richard's impenetrable facade. It was subtle, but was there. The executive leaned back in his chair, his gaze cold. "You don't understand, Kyle. This isn't just about you. This is about the future of the company. We can't afford to let this go any further. The damage you're doing, it's irreparable." Kyle shook his head, refusing to be cowed. "The damage is already done. The only question now is whether you're willing to face it." There was a long silence as the executives exchanged glances, the weight of the moment settling heavily in the room. The legal team had been silent up until now, but one of the lawyers, a stern-looking woman with glasses, finally spoke. "It's clear that you're determined to see this through," she said. "But you need to understand that this could cost you everything. Your career, your reputation, your future in this industry. Once the company takes its position, it will be difficult for anyone to side with you. You're setting yourself up for a very long, hard road, Kyle. Are you sure you want to continue?" Kyle's chest tightened, but he didn't flinch. He thought about everything he had sacrificed to get to this point, his dignity, his peace of mind, his relationships, the weight of carrying this battle alone. He thought about the people who had suffered in silence before him, and the people who were still too afraid to speak out. He thought about his family, his friends, Jasmine, and the quiet support they had all shown him. He wasn't doing this for the career he might lose. He wasn't doing this for the money or the recognition. He was doing this because he couldn't live with himself if he didn't. "I'm sure," Kyle said, "because if I don't fight this now, if I don't stand up for what's right, I'll lose everything anyway. So I'd rather lose it on my terms, fighting for what matters." The room was quiet. The executives looked at each other, then at Kyle. There was a tense moment where nothing seemed to move, and then the lead executive sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly. "Very well, Kyle," he said, his voice softer now, almost resigned. "If this is the path you want to take, we'll proceed. But be aware that we'll use every resource at our disposal to make sure we're not the ones who lose." As Kyle stood up to leave the room, the weight of what had just transpired began to sink in. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot, but for the first time in a long while, he felt a flicker of hope. The truth was out now, and no matter how hard the company tried to bury it, it would not be silenced. As Kyle left the building that evening, the sun dipping low on the horizon, he felt a sense of finality that had been missing for so long. He had done it. He had made his stand, and now there was no going back. The company had been forced to face the consequences of its actions, and there was no turning the tide. The fight was no longer just his own. It was a movement, a reckoning, one that would echo beyond the walls of the office and into the very fabric of the industry itself. The battle for justice had just begun, and Kyle Jackson was ready to see it through to the end.